All right. Welcome. We are here live on the Ujamaa Hour. I am Michael Strode, your host for this evening, and we will be bringing you a lovely selection of solidarity, economy, cooperation, capital, autonomy, liberated zones. This is what we're here for. The Ujamaa Hour is the space where we talk deeply about cooperative economics, but we are really trying to get deeper beneath the surface, beneath the layers, right? So sometimes when we talk about cooperative economics, we talk about it from a lens, from a framework that embeds us and leaves us within the same system that we are currently situated in. But ultimately, when we talk about cooperative economics, we need to be talking about how do we shift our orientation, shift our paradigm, shift our lens, and move outside. How can we imagine further beyond the context in which we exist now and imagine what the context is for the future? So when we talk about cooperative economics on the Ujamaa Hour, we are talking about a future-oriented economic system, a future-oriented economic lens. And that's what we'll be doing here this evening. So if you are there in the chat section, in Biba, or on the Kola Nut Collab page, wherever you are watching this, please make sure you hop in that comment section and give a shout. This is a community that we have embedded here. Have a conversation. Do not be afraid to ask a question before the segment is done. In fact, please post your questions inside of the chat section, because at the end of the segment, we want to make sure that we get to some of those questions. We want to make sure that we answer some inquiries that you might have about what we've been covering here so far. So, yes, if you are in that section, please give a shout. Black power, black love, black unity, black sanity, black life, black joy, all of those things. We are here for you at the Ujamaa Hour on this Movement Monday edition. All right, so give me a moment to situate myself, and then we will kick into the segment. So the Ujamaa Hour is brought to you, of course, that logo that you see in the bottom right corner, by the Bridge Embassy for Black America. Bridge Embassy for Black America is a space where we build to protect black. What are we talking about when we say build to protect black? Again, we're talking about black communities, black love, black sanity, black life. We're talking about all those spaces that are worth protecting, all of those spaces that are worth making safe. That is what we're doing with the Bridge Embassy for Black America. We are also brought to you by the Kola Nut Collaborative. The Kola Nut Collaborative is an initiative launched 2 years ago that initially sought to think through how we could bring time banking to communities in Chicago, and how we could bring time banking in a way that was not simply about altruism, but was really about a conversation around how communities think about what assets exist, what skill sets exist inside of their communities, and then how they begin to utilize those assets to address needs directly in the community. So bypassing the need for financial capital, how again do we think about how our skill sets connect, how our relationships connect us, how we cultivate that social capital inside of communities, and then begin to address those problems that we have in our communities, thinking about our intellectual capacity, our experiential capacity, how we think about our cultural capacity, how we think about all of those things as assets, as forms of capital that we can utilize directly, bypassing financial capital. When we talk about those 8 forms of capital, which you might know if you have your Neo Green book, yes, we still need it. So if you don't have your Neo Green book, then I will list off those 8 forms of capital as they are noted in the Green book for you. Spiritual capital, the spiritual, religious, and ethical practices that we bring to our space, to our world, to our community, to our relationships. Natural capital, all of those things that are embedded in the geology around us, soil, water, air. How are we cultivating and protecting that natural capital that exists in our communities? Human capital, all of the skills, knowledge, and experiences that people bring to the community. Cultural capital, maximizing that historical legacy, that ancestral culture that we brought with us from those spaces where we were cleaving onto, that genetic memory. Social capital, the network of relationships. Political capital, the influence of the political state and the political space in your community. So it's not simply having a good relationship with your local alderman, but it's how you think about your ability to influence the decision-making patterns of the elected officials in your region and in regions around you. Physical capital, all of that built environment, all of the structures inside of your community. Financial capital. So one eighth of those 8 forms of capital is financial. How are we looking at our relationship to all of those other forms of capital? And then how are we even surpassing the notion that we need to get into the taxonomy of capitalism and segment them into capital, but really think of them as just resources that exist around us, that we should be making use of, that we have a right to, that we have access to, that we have available to us, and that we can use to cultivate liberated spaces for ourselves. All right. So, since the last time we were here on the Ujamaa Hour, there's a lot that's been going on, right? So first of all, you know that we cover on the Ujamaa Hour every month. We're talking about 4 core topics. Those core topics are going to be cooperation. So how do human beings come together and build relationships with one another to locate their mutual interest and get things done in that context, right? So looking at relationships that are mutually beneficial, thinking about ways that we can cooperate to move our goals forward. Cooperation is the foundation of human societies. The reason that people come together as tribes is because they cultivated a bit of trust with one another, and then they realized that they could probably get more done together than they could get done apart. So cooperation, we're thinking about that at its fundamental, right? So before we get to the development of worker-owned cooperatives, before we get to the development of housing cooperatives, before we get to the development of consumer cooperatives, what is cooperation at its fundamental essence, at the basis, right? So that we're thinking about cooperation, we're thinking about capital, and so we talked a moment ago, right? We're thinking about capital beyond how we are generally taught to think about capital, right? Taught to think about, having collateral so that we can take out a loan against that collateral and then, use that collateralized debt to go and use money to make more money. But how are we talking about all of the other forms of capital that exist, and what is it that we can do with that capital if we stretch our imaginations a bit? We're talking about economy. So we're looking at this notion of economy as something that we can understand. Often when we talk about this notion of economics, perhaps you studied macroeconomics and microeconomics in school, but when we're talking about economy, we're really just talking about, as Movement Generation framed it, it's something that we do every day, right? You can understand the economy because it's something that you do every day. You have relationships. You make exchanges that are non-monetary in nature all the time. You trade favors. You engage in this network of exchange, production, trade, and in several of those situations, in several instances, no money changes hands. So we're thinking about economy as something that we can understand, and then we can shift the lens and think about ourselves as economic actors. We have the ability to influence the economy in our communities, in our neighborhoods, in our relationships, in our spaces. So we're thinking about economy in that framework and in that way. And then finally, we're thinking about autonomy. Because ultimately, the goal of cooperating with one another and then pooling whatever assets we have and then creating an economy from that combination of that cooperation and capital, we want to be able to leverage those forces in order to create autonomous spaces for ourselves, spaces where we don't have to jostle with such great difficulty with political officials, because they recognize that we've already asserted our power and we've determined that this is what we want to do going forward. So they're either on the train or they're off, right? And so ultimately we're talking about, again, those four key elements: cooperation, capital, economy, and autonomy. And so several things have happened since the last segment. So with the last segment, of course, we had La Tierra Pifus out of Philly, and we talked extensively about some work that she's been doing around time banking in Philadelphia with the Womanist Working Collective, also with the Replenish Black Joy series, as well as and the time bank itself is called Reciprocity. And so what we are attempting to do inside of the Ujamaa Hour is I'm attempting to satiate a bit of curiosity for myself, right? I came to the Ujamaa Hour off of some prompting from Tequila Shabazz, looking to answer a question: is there a shared economic narrative around economic democracy that we have in our movement spaces, that we have in our organizations, that we can tease out, that we can tease apart, right? Do we actually have an economic agenda? And oftentimes, you know, and I'll get to this. In fact, I'll jump into this space where we'll talk about Boss, right? So recently, PBS released this documentary, Boss, the history of Black business in America, and you know, I mean, it's sort of one of those untold stories things. Effectively, you know, you release the documentary, you start to go back and you get a few histories, and you draw it forward, and ultimately, every documentary is an act of curation. So, you know, when I say that it's a selective act of curation around the history of Black business in America, I'm not saying that to be derisive, but you know, effectively, the folks who produced it and directed it and scripted it and sculpted it had a particular way that they wanted that flow to come out, and so what I want to be clear about is that when we talk about it being a selective history, there's a particular place that it started, and there's a place where it ended, right? And so where it starts is where we are we are Black folks in America who have recently come into some physical liberation, and we are attempting to effect an economic liberation, right? You know, we recognize that, you know, that physical liberation wasn't certain, and if we didn't get some economic liberation, then you know it wasn't long before we might go back into physical bondage. So we get to this space where we recognize that we have a measure of physical liberation. We're looking for a measure of economic liberation and economic autonomy. And so we begin to become entrepreneurs in the process of thinking through how do we, again, create greater autonomy for ourselves from a system that we recognize that we could not rely on. We couldn't rely on the economic system of folks who had just now walked away from slaveholding in name only. And so we were trying to cultivate autonomous spaces for ourselves, and that's how we use entrepreneurship. And so when you go back to the roles of the National Negro Business League and things of that nature, you will see it's several times referenced in there how we are developing cooperatives, because we've recognized, again, back to cooperation as that fundamental element of human society. We recognized that we could probably get more done together than we could get done apart, and we needed some principal ways to kind of come together and do those things. So we developed cooperative businesses for that purpose, and you know, several of those elements, several of those businesses and those endeavors got us killed, as evidenced by the work of Ida B. Wells and you know, just the coverage of lynching and the history of People's Grocery in Memphis. So me teasing out these questions around whether or not we have an economic orientation that is divorced from specifically from the sort of market economics and you know and sort of the pursuit of capitalism is something that I was searching for, because oftentimes in just in the screening that I was in for Boss, so I attended a screening at the Quarry Event Center, and oftentimes I listen in a room. It's really critical for me, you know, to listen, to kind of hear what's going on, to hear what's coming out in the room, because ultimately that helps me to understand where I see things going, and then where I can kind of intervene. And so, in discussing the sort of role of business in Black communities in that room, we kind of came back to the same talking points. You know, yeah, we need to work together. You know, we need to buy back the block. ultimately, in all of these conversations, we get back to this situation where we are talking about how do we cultivate individual community wealth. And when you talk about cultivating individual community wealth, you actually don't gain the power of the network in that situation, in that scenario. If there's not some principled agreements around how people are connected, then ultimately individual community wealth really just allows you to divorce yourself from collective work and responsibility, which is the other principle, Ujamaa, right? And so, in hearing that, in seeing Boss, and kind of thinking through what was told in that story and what was not told, what I don't think was told was, for me, what truly got us thus far, right? What truly got us thus far in terms of the sort of entrepreneurial legacy was really about a story of cooperation. And then, you get to at that point in the documentary where we get to Reginald Lewis in the 80s and, that buyout of Beatrice Foods, right? And at that point, it sort of blows away. It's like, oh, okay, right. I don't have to depend on anybody. I can locate venture capital funding and, I can get my own, right? And that's when we get to a point where we start to kind of branch off into the history of venture capital funding and its relationship now to black business, right? So that there's a deliberate turn in the story there, Boss. And I was really I felt concerned because I recognize that that venture capital is like all big money, right? Like all big dollars, there's this sort of dangerous nature there in terms of how we think about our relationship to liberation and how we think about our relationship to this massive influx of capital. And if we actually are not prepared from having sort of a principled cooperation, a principled understanding of this sort of economy that we are cultivating, if we don't have some economic principles, then ultimately all money will show up, and it will likely destroy relationships. And I'm saying that just couched in the sort of an untold history that probably I don't have even the responsibility to reveal at this moment, right? But I mean, recognizing that that's been at the root of several organizational breakups, right? And so we want to make sure that we are thinking through what our principles are around the economies that we are creating, and then, how we talk about those in relationship to one another. So that's my long intro. I hope it wasn't too long. And now I want to get into the real core of the segment this evening. So we have a wonderful guest on this evening, someone that I appreciate dearly. We met in the context of the Black Oak Center and Healthy Food Hub, and I'm fairly certain that I had been hearing the name, and people were talking, they'd be like, hey, do you know Nora? And I didn't, right? I had no idea. But in meeting her, and then in the context of the Healthy Food Hub, coming to lean on her quite a bit, and then when she had to kind of move, and then I just kind of being all sullen because I was like, man, who gonna do all this work? There's a real appreciation of the work ethic that she brings, of the analysis that she brings, of the seriousness that she brings, and I really want to dig deep into sort of that legacy and that history. So we have on the line on the show this evening, we've got our food justice activista, writer, organizer, prison abolitionist, all top-lined in the bio. The illustrious Dara Cooper is on this evening. I'm going to go ahead and bring her into the segment now. So, Dara, say hello to the show. Welcome.
Hey, y'all. So y'all get to see me teasing hard for that intro. Thank you, Baba Mike. That's so beautiful.
Yes. Well, I mean, it's all true. It's all true. Unscripted. It's
very
from the heart. So I really, believe in the power of a firsthand narrative. So could you just maybe talk a bit about your backstory? What sort of brings you to the work that you are doing now? And you can make it as long or as short as neat as you need to be.
Yeah, I was like, how long is this segment? Let me see.
Yes,
I'll give you the brief version here.
Yes.
Well,
Yeah, so
let's see. I mean, go ahead. Sorry.
No, yeah, definitely. So you jump right in. If tell us about how you acquired your superpowers, and then we'll dig deeper with some of the questions I'll come with later.
Well, okay. So, peace, everyone. It's an honor to be here. I am such a fan of this work and also of you, Mike. As you mentioned, we go back to the Healthy Food Hub days and Black Oaks days, which actually I always lift up as my sort of food political home. And the place that I was politicized around the possibilities of exactly what you mentioned earlier around the sort of future economic system that we can envision. And no better place and no critical place to do that but the food system. So I'll get into that in a bit. So for folks who don't know, my name is Dara Cooper. I'm with the National Black Food and Justice Alliance, which we'll probably talk a bit more about later. But in short, it's an alliance of radical Black-led organizations working around food sovereignty, particularly in the terrain of what we call self-determining food economies and also land justice. So we'll talk about that. But I have the great privilege of working with amazing folks around the country doing really incredible work. And so what got me there is, I think I was born with my fist up, probably, but let my mother tell it. And also just to be honest, or just to recognize that I actually do come from a long line of who I consider freedom fighters and radical Black feminists and, some who identify as nationalists, some who identify, in other ways. And so I come from a long line, I think, of radical folks. And when I got into food and land work, I think I'd say maybe, 10, 12, 15 years ago. But I remember this moment where I would go to different conferences and see a whole bunch of white farmers everywhere. And I'm like, surely there are Black people who farm. My goodness. Like, I know. And I actually talked to my grandmother, and I have very vivid memories of my grandmother who grew up on a farm. And she would tell me all these different stories. But at one point, I realized in the middle of my work that my mother's family was from Johnson City, Tennessee. And they were displaced from their home. So they were on a farm. They had all kinds of fruit-based businesses and moonshine businesses at the time. And the sheriff came and wanted a piece of whatever my family had going on. And it ended very not well. It ended where my family had to flee from Tennessee, leaving all the land, all the farms, all the homes that they owned, or the home that they owned and knew. And I learned that story in that great detail, actually. Again, when I was doing this work, I think I was living in D.C. At that moment, you know how you hear about the so-called Great Migration, and you hear about people looking for like economic opportunities, and people frame it in the ways of, sometimes in terms of Black people looking for better economic opportunities. Well, that's true. And there's a thing around, there is a such thing as economic violence, right? And the violence that our folks face and looking for a better life. But the reality of when I think about the actual physical, spiritual, all kinds of forms of violence, but especially the physical violence that Black people faced and continue to, but at that time faced, and we're actually escaping from, we don't talk about that enough, right? The actual, burning of houses and, the lynchings, and you mentioned Ida B. Wells earlier, and so there's a whole context that my family, that landed my folks in Ohio and then Chicago. And so thinking about that story is just thinking about the context of the violence that Black people face in this country and that create the conditions in which we're trying to navigate, right? Um, so understanding that story, understanding that we ended up in Ohio, but just completely displaced from the land, that the ancestral land that my grandmother knew, her mother's, so we were disconnected from that. And that's not by happenstance. It was happenstance. It was actually state instigated by the state, right? And then on my father's from Bainbridge, Georgia, and in this case, the Klan ran them out, and that's how we ended up in Atlanta. So just thinking about both my maternal and paternal side, where we had home, we had a place, and we were violently driven off of that land. So anyway, so those two backstories are what drives me. Like, I have this really strong drive around Black people's ability and right to have a place, to have a stable, sustainable, safe, nourishing place for our families and our communities. And I think, well, obviously, a lot of that is, I think, ancestrally driven, and it's just deeply personal, So on the food side, I got into food justice specifically. So let me say, actually, food, I've always been interested in land, super interested around, I followed very closely the land reform work happening in Southern Africa, was super politicized around, the anti-apartheid movement. I grew up going to different protests. I grew up, boycotting different companies or whatever, and so apartheid is very, clear to me, but also politicized around land and thinking about the land question after, apartheid ended. And so followed that very closely, and obviously in Zimbabwe and Namibia. So there's a lot of critical questions that I, have been following in Southern Africa throughout my life. And then right now, too, there's so much to talk about in terms of Southern Africa. But that's what influenced me politically. And understanding my own, conditions. So I've always been interested in land, but I really got more into land justice through food justice work, right? And so I got into food justice because I was actually, we could talk maybe later about more of my other lives, but as an organizer, I'm always looking for what are the things that can impact our people's material conditions, and also would compel us to action, right? And so we see the action around police violence, right? The turn up around police violence, which is so justified, and mass incarceration, which is so justified. One of the things I thought that our folks were going to turn up around was actually food, because when I think about the cost of food, when I think, and actually we saw that in other countries too, people actually protesting around food. But when I think about the cost of food, and just quite frankly, just my basic observations growing up with the direct correlation between the quality of food Black communities get and the quality of food white communities get, it was such a stark contrast, and still is. And I think just being just that started to politicize me, was just seeing just the basic differences around that. Once I got into food, I started asking more questions, not even around the quality and access, but also who owns what, right? And so hopefully we'll get into the ownership questions around, the sort of notion of individual ownership versus, collective and cooperative. But on the baseline, my first question was, what's the racial composition of the food businesses and the grocery stores and all of that. And so, I met Dr. Jafunza Wright and Fred Carter. Oh, when was that? What would you say when we were working together? How long ago was that?
I started around 2009.
Oh, 10 years ago.
Yeah.
Wow. Okay, so I think you were already there. So maybe 9 years ago for me. I don't know.
Okay.
I don't know what time is anyway, but Yeah, and so I don't know if you want us to get into the healthy food hub stuff, but I would say that just the type of um, culture, economy building that was happening through our food system was um, just something I had never experienced before, and just the way that we were building community together and like dreaming and actually practicing what we believed in, and so it taught me um, just to dream about the possibilities outside of this system, I think, in concrete ways, and like we can test it out with each other, right? And so that's what we were doing. There's something that you said earlier about being clear about principles in this work. What I will also say from my experience is also practice, right? So it's having an analysis, but it's also the practical application of what we believe, right? And so that's what was so, there's some clicking sound. I don't know if you hear it, but there's with some practical application to what we say we believe, what are our values, that we need to actually play out. And another piece of that is like decolonizing, right? Which we can get into a whole conversation around. But what I mean by that is, how do we deconstruct all the ways in which we've been conditioned in these really horrid systems of white supremacy, of capitalism, of sexist patriarchy? How are we deconstructing that so that that very system that we say we want to see happen, we're not continuing to further perpetuate that, right? But back to the healthy food hub, it's creating some there's a vision, there's values together, and then there's also some praxis around what's our ideology, but then how are we applying this, right, in real life? And so for folks who don't know, I'm sure y'all know, you've been talking to Michael this whole time. I'm sure y'all know the Healthy Food Hub. But for anybody who doesn't know, it was, I think what we called it a reverse CSA. It's a way to build community, to be able to support our local farmers in Pembroke, Illinois, which is an hour south of Chicago, but also just a way to build community and come in together in purchasing food together. But it was so much more than that, so it was a collective buying. Sorry, it is. It's not over. I'm saying was in past tense, y'all, because I'm not in Chicago. It's still going, but I'm no longer there, unfortunately. But it was I think one of the most I know, hands down, one of the most impactful political experiment. I'm gonna call it an experiment because that's what it all is, right? We're experimenting with. We have this vision, we have this economy that we want to see happen, we have this way we want to relate to each other, we have this vision of our people being able to be healthy and have access to things that we actually need, and we can collectively control it. So we have this vision, and it's just this testing that we're doing and experimenting with each other, because that's what we have to do.
That was definitely value packed, and certainly I also have moments of reflection, and it's only recently that I've been able to go back and read Melissa Figueroa. I don't know if you were there when Melissa was volunteering at the hub, but Melissa ended up going off to Berkeley and then writing her thesis with elements of just kind of the work with the Healthy Food Hub. And what I was able to see in reflection just through someone else's eyes, by hearing the story of the Healthy Food Hub, through that retelling, was this notion that I talked about this a bit with Brother Kamal Rashid. This notion that, like maroon societies, maroon societies also were experiments. They were recognizing that, we're fleeing this system of activity, we're going off to this space where we can have autonomy, and then we are constructing new forms of governance there that are somewhat reflective of governance that we remember, that we came from. And so just this notion that in that same way, this experiment of the Healthy Food Hub was also like maroon society. It was people flashing one another. It was people, building relationships, breaking relationships, being getting down in tearful breakout sessions and breakdown sessions. Really just being challenged in the context to continue cultivating community even when it's hard, right?
Yeah.
Necessarily so when it's hard. So what I want to just posit to you, on that basis, so what values lie at the heart of your liberatory practice? You know, I mean, you got a lot of spaces where you work doing liberation work. What are the values that are at the core and at the base of that for you?
Yeah, I love that. Can you hear me okay?
I can indeed.
Okay, beautiful. Yeah, so, there are many values. And I was actually curious about yours, too. So if I go, will you share yours with me, too?
I will.
Okay. I think that what is a non-negotiable for all of us is to root this in love, right? And root this work in love. Love for our people, love for the planet. And so I typically talk about it as eco-affirming, right? And so a value that I think is important is I want to see us have an economy that actually values our whole selves and all of ourselves, right? And so and also I want us to see an economy that values the planet. We don't have a choice but to think sustainably. And so I want us to really get that. And I'm saying that for a reason, because I think that some people end up having an economy. Never mind. I'm not going to go there. That'll be an offline conversation. But but like we want it to be eco-affirming. That we have to be intentional about that, and that means a whole different type of way of being, right? It's antithetical to everything that we've been conditioned to be in this country. And what I mean by that is, we always want more. We want the latest. We need, and then it's this skewed definition of our needs versus our wants, right? And so the values, again, rooted in love, eco-affirming, sustaining, that value. So collective is a value, meaning all of our folks. We want to bring all our folks along, right? We want them politicized. We want them to deconstruct all the nonsense. And I'm a radical Black feminist, so I believe that we need to, have a deep value in how we understand the leadership, the contributions of women, right? And that's all women, right? And so including trans women and also GNC folks, gender nonconforming folks. And so a value that I hold very dear is that we want all our people free, right? All our people get to come to this economy as long as, and that we believe in safety, we value each other's well-being, all of those things. And so a lot of those values are important to me. It's just how we treat each other with dignity, with love, with respect. We may not have to like each other in this space. I hope we do. I value having fun with each other. I value art. I value so much. I value beauty and joy, right? And we've got to figure out a way to work together. We got to figure out a way to move through conflict in deeper ways, and so. Or in better ways, rather. And so those are some of my values that that guide a lot of my work. So.
Yes.
What would you say?
Well,
because I'm gonna be like, yeah, that too.
So I'll start here where I usually do a sort of a circle opening activity where I pass sort of circle pass the question around. What's your real or imagined superpower? And one time when I posed that question to the circle, and I had to answer the question, I ended up coming up with this phrase I called empathic individualization. And the way that breaks down is that okay, so you have empathy, which is the ability to begin to identify deeply with the experiences of someone else. Then you have this term individualization, which I picked up while I was sitting in a brand strategy class, and that's sort of maybe a throwaway conversation, but this is a fitting term, right? Because individualization is this idea that you are in such deep collaboration with the group that you begin to identify in people skill sets that are applicable to needs in the team. So effectively, it's the sense of deep collaboration, deep relationship, where you're looking at what does the team need, and if there's someone who already has that skill that we're not hearing from, that others may not know about. And so these two qualities, empathic individualization, I actually, dropped it back, to sort of pop culture, the show, TV show Heroes. You had a character on there named Siler, who had the ability to, crack open skulls and examine folks' brains, right? That's a very extractive form of learning, right? But then you had this character, Peter, who had the ability to touch people and then draw upon their experiences and inherit their powers, right, their capacities. And I see sort of that phrase embodying the sort of duality of that. I do have the tactical, critical deconstruction and analysis that I can bring to a situation, but then I also recognize that we don't need to tear each other apart to get to the root, right? About protecting those relationships. So yeah, that's one big one. And then the other ones also kind of speak to the strengths that I feel like I bring to spaces. So just certainly there's authenticity, there's compassion, there is deep listening. So those values that I bring to spaces, and I feel like bringing those values to space allows me to hear other values that are in the room that are unpronounced, that are unspoken, and then ultimately cultivate that sort of group investment, that those shared values that I think drive us forward. So.
I love that. I'm gonna copy the compassion one.
Compassion and there's a certain measure of diplomacy. I'm challenged sometimes where I say diplomacy, and sometimes when we hear that word, we kind of think people just lying, right? You just lying. That's not being diplomatic, but it's recognizing that sometimes we are working to protect the nature of relationships so that we get the opportunity to deepen our investment or to pour into that relationship later. So it's like, okay, I got to talk about this way right now because you're not ready to hear this. And then, there's the opportunity, there's the opening where someone asks, and you're like, now you're ready, and I really would love to tell you that.
Right.
So, yeah.
Yeah, and we want to handle each other with care. We that's actually, thank you for naming that. That's another value. It's we don't want to be callous with each other too. And so I don't know if that's the same as diplomacy. Like when I think of diplomacy, I think about how we want to deliver, either a critique or whatever it is that we want to deliver to someone. I'm always thinking about a critique. But, I do it as I would want to receive it, And so I think we have to be careful with how we communicate with each other. And root that in care and some compassion. So.
Absolutely. So I'm going to invoke another name from the Healthy Food Hub here, Mama Chapanduka. I see Mama sorry. Oh, Mama Cha is on the line. Okay, so yeah, we got.
Oh,
Mama,
my God!
And we got Mama Cha, who might be listening in as they join. Just wait and say hello if you all are. We love you all out there. But so Mama Cha,
thank y'all so much if y'all listening.
Yes, we do indeed. So Mama Cha would always invoke and reiterate to all the young folk, that was around, the value of being in an organization. So your work being rooted in National Black Food Justice Alliance, Heal Food Alliance, James Beard Foundation, Black Urban Growers, there's a lot of folks, named there, Movement for Black Lives. So how do you see the value of engaging in organizational work? I mean, you're certainly skilled enough that, you could go off and you could choose to be an independent consultant, which is kind of in vogue nowadays, right? But why do you choose to kind of align and engage in organizations and institutions? In fact, I would say networks, organizations, and institutions in the way that you do.
Good question. Can you repeat the line from Mama Cha? I didn't hear it earlier.
Well,
What did she say?
I'll paraphrase it, but Mama Cha would just always talk about the value of being involved in an organization. So when folks talk about that they wanted to make change, that they wanted to engage in something that would impact the world. In fact, I hope I broke up. But she would always talk about the value of organization.
To single-handedly, these white supremacist narratives and visions of our history would try to tell you otherwise, but it's not true. It always has taken movement and being organized to affect change and affect the type of change we want to see. And so that's the reason why I think it's and it also could be that I'm also a student of the All African People's Revolutionary Party in college, and then of course being around folks at the Healthy Food Hub, Mama Cha, Mama Saru, but just so I was like, maybe it could have been the politicizing of the All African People's Revolutionary Party, but also common sense tells us if we study our history, there's no way we can do this without being in formation some way or another. And I would even go a step further. So the formations I'm in are formations of formations, right? So it's like the type of radical change we need to see, particularly if we're just thinking about the food system alone, but you can't take out the food system, you can't take out land, you can't disentangle that from what we're actually talking about, which is capitalism, racial capitalism, right? And so so take this ginormous system, this empire that we see here. It's going to take us being organized locally. It's going to take us being organized in various regions. It's going to take us being organized nationally. And quite frankly, it's going to take an international strategy too. And so the type of change I'm invested in seeing, that I'm committing and have committed my life to, is going to take being an organization. Let me also clarify something though. James Beard is not an organization, so I don't want that to be my affiliation. It's just an award, that is what it is. But it's not, and that's definitely not a political formation. So just to clarify. But we, the National Black Food and Justice Alliance, and I will also say that I've been a member of the Malcolm X grassroots movement for about 10 years, I think, too. So I was in the D.C. chapter, the New York chapter, and now I'm here in Atlanta. Which is a revolutionary nationalist organization. I don't know if that answers your question, but I can't see how we can affect the change that we want to see. People like to believe they can. And it's not to say we don't have, individual power to control what we can control. But if we really need to be thinking about the systems that impact our collective lives. And the reality is that all the things that I'm fighting against, that I'm resisting against, you are too. So why would we be doing this separately? Why not think about ways? Now, we have different, of course, ideological frameworks, ways in which we think about the ways that we need to address and move forward, right? And quite frankly, we have different versions of the North Star that we're trying to get to, right? But to the best of our ability, how can we see where our intersecting interests are and move forward together, We need each other.
Absolutely.
Mm-hmm.
So we talked about this a bit earlier, but I just want to revisit it just because it's a real key to how the segment is framed for me. But just reiterate maybe again what you see as the economic dimensions of your work, and then how you see your work as advancing these ideas of economic democracy and solidarity economy. I did have an opportunity to meet while she was visiting town, Jamila Medley, and she had talked about meeting Baba Fred and and yourself out at the National Black Food Justice Alliance meetup. And so, in fact, maybe you can just embed or talk talk about maybe some of the work that was happening at that meeting, as long as it's ready for disclosure.
At which meeting? Say that again.
So there was I don't really know the sort of date of the national meetup, but effectively Jamila was there. Barbara Fred I heard was there. And
okay, got it. I think I know what you're talking about.
So
yeah, I'm a big fan of Jamila, and of course I'm a big fan of Barbara Fred.
Yeah.
So where do I start? So the National Black Food and Justice Alliance. We have two major work groups. Just added another one too on policy, local and national policy. But our major work areas are what I mentioned: land justice, which is anchoring what we're calling the Black Land and Power Initiative, which I can talk about later if you want. And it's mostly thinking about collective approaches, completely thinking about collective approaches to land. Ultimately, land reform that needs to happen, but a strong land justice movement in the U.S. And then our other work area is what we call self-determining food economies, which again was largely influenced by the Healthy Food Hub and Black Oak. So in this, and also the Detroit Black Community Food Security Network. So let me say also the Alliance was founded by Black-led organizations who, connected to your last question, who understood that, folks are doing incredible work, but ultimately what we need to be getting towards, we're going to need each other. We're going to need to be strategic together to resist against the system and also build a different type of system, on the other side of this. And so what I find such great inspiration in this work around is mostly, just how we're practicing in all these different terrains, what a different economy can look like, right? And what a different way of being can look like. What does it look like when we collectively govern and our own institutions and our communities. And so there's a lot of practice around that within different members of the National Black Food and Justice Alliance. And so the Detroit Black Community Food Security Network is currently launching a People's Food Co-op in Detroit. And several other of our members also, we realized were either getting ready to start a food co-op or had already started one. So at the time, there was Renaissance in North Carolina and Durham, North Carolina, Brooklyn Movement Center in Brooklyn, New York. They're working on a co-op, a food co-op. And so what the Alliance did was convened all these different folks who were either getting ready to or had already started a food co-op so that we can create a space where we can build out our capacity and really talk about how we make sure that, we're sharing just advice to folks and insight around what it means. We also had LaDonna Redmond, who is just literally one of the most brilliant people I know, but out of Minneapolis, who, helped us. She's working at Seaward Co-op in Minneapolis, but came in as a content expert. She's also an organizer, just a really brilliant thought partner. So, and then we had Ed Whitfield, too, who's also been a part of it. So he was a part of Renaissance Food Co-op. And I know you all have talked about liberated zones, I think, maybe. And so, just brought in comrades. And we were like, let's just talk to each other and figure out how we can build community together so that we're not thinking about or working on this in isolation. So that actually happened, I think, for the first time either a year or 2 years ago. Time, y'all, is just really hard for me. I don't understand time, but it happened a while ago. And then we did a follow-up meeting in January to continue parsing out what do we mean by self-determining food economies? What could it look like, and what will it take for Black people to be in the position to actually control more of our own economies around food, right? It's our responsibility, right? Because right now, we're majority wholesale reliant on these corporations to feed us, and we know we can't rely on that, right? For so many different reasons. And so what this work is about is to really get us to think deeper around and more collectively around, defining what does a self-determined food economy look like, and exactly to your question earlier around the values and what would we see differently, right? And be really rooted in that. So that's the larger picture. A lot of that has to do with understanding currently even where is the distribution happening. There's an incredible organization everybody should know about. I'm sure y'all probably already talked about it, but the Federation of Seven Cooperatives, with so many co-ops here in the South, where they're already, Ben Burkett from MAC, Mississippi Association of Cooperatives, has already been routing, I think, for over a decade, probably way longer, probably decades, to Chicago. So they grow watermelon, sweet potato, all kinds of stuff too. I think the first time I actually ever met him was through Doc, through the Healthy Food Hub, actually, years ago. But now, I get to work with them a lot more. But the point is there are organizations who are already growing quite a bit of food, they are already connected to, farmers and cooperatives that are growing quite a bit of food. So a lot of the self-determining food economies work that we envision, a lot of the assets, a lot of the experience, a lot of the parts are in place. But there are so many other layers to Black people's work within this food system that I still understand that clearly need to be better connected. And I also want to shout out in this too, there's an organization called Black Church Food Security Network, Reverend Heber Brown out of Baltimore, who's been doing some distribution and some routing from Black farmers in North Carolina up to Baltimore too. And so it's just really thinking about, ideally, obviously, we want to be as local as possible and, and we want to support and figure out our infrastructure so that Black farmers are able to, as Baba Malik Yakini talks about, growing food, from Black communities that can actually land in our own plates, right? And so how do we make those connections? So a lot of our work around self-determining food economies is really looking at all parts of the food system and mapping and understanding where our folks are, and also figuring out where the gaps are and where we need better agency. We need better agency all the way around, but where we need better capacity. Right? So, did I answer your question? Probably, and then some.
No, it definitely does.
Okay.
And it's a good pivot. So, one pivot is, I did see that the Federation made the big announcement of revamping their website, today. So, clap it up for the Federation of Southern Cooperatives.
Yes.
They got their website up to par, so that we can find all of the good things that are happening. So, yes, make sure you go to federation.coop because, there's a lot of good information there. When I was checking the website earlier, I was reading, and this will be a pivot to the discussion around ownership. So they spoke about sort of the state-based cooperative development, and I'll read this first paragraph. We focus on developing 1 to 3 cooperatives each year in each state. In South Carolina, we're working with new members to start up the Southeast Fishermen's Cooperative, as well as outreaching to veteran state association members to provide older cooperatives. In Georgia, we're initiating a campaign to organize home child care providers into cooperatives. We're working with state staff to strengthen the Southern Alternative, a value-added pecan cooperative. We conducted Co-op 101 workshops to make presentations to communities in the Atlanta area interested in forming cooperatives. So all of that is some announcements that are made on their cooperative development page listed as Terrence Courtney's work. So maybe you can use that to kind of speak to what's the critical nature of sort of shared ownership for you, and when you were thinking of shared ownership earlier and when you were referencing it, was there something more that you were referencing around shared ownership? Were you looking at sort of shared ownership of workplace, shared ownership of land? So what's the sort of dimensions of that for you, and what's the importance of that for you?
Thank you for that. There was something I was going to mention about the Federation before I go into the shared ownership that escaped me. So hopefully it'll come back. But I don't necessarily remember where I was going earlier with it, probably around land. Let me say I don't believe that we can own land. But just like air, nor water, nor, you know, any of these elements. And we also live in a society that commodifies these, you know, commodifies land, commodifies water. And that doesn't serve us, right? Never has, never will. And so the way we've been talking about our land justice work in the Black Land Empowered space that the Alliance helped to incubate is how do we get land off the speculative market and think about it in more of a sense of a commons, or, you know, a place where we have better, you know, sustainable access to. Because it's a horrid, violent thing to be displaced, you know, from the land that you build a relationship with, right? And so when, you know, in a capitalist, you know, mindset, all you think about is this as a commodity, and, you know, you're not necessarily thinking about the actual spiritual, you know, cultural, all the connections we have to land, right? And so what we want to see is that reconnecting, that restoration, the restoring of and repairing of the relationship that we've been severed. Black people have been severed from obviously our homeland, homeland, but Black people in this country particularly, but also, you know, just all the ways in which that I mentioned earlier where we've been displaced. So we want to see a repairing of that. So it's not about expanding Black ownership of land just for the sake of that. And let me also say we also always have to think about in our relationships to our respect for Indigenous comrades here in the U.S. and their right to sovereignty. And so we want to be doing this and thinking about all of this in deeply respectful ways as we build relationships and think about this. But with that, so in terms of the collective sense around land, I'm going to actually shout out, so there's this comrade, Francia Marquez, out of Colombia, and I talk about this a lot. So I was at a Federation meeting. Oh, this is what I was going to say about the Federation. In August, y'all look out for their annual meeting. I have a story about also how I was politicized around Black farmers, specifically in Pembroke, but also at the Federation. So I'll get to that in a minute. But yeah, check out their annual event in August is what I was going to say. So I was at the annual event one year, and at the time, the Alliance was going through this campaign around, there was this Black farmer, Eddie Wise and Dorothy Wise, may she rest in peace, who had had their land taken from them. And so it was like 7 o'clock in the morning, January, some armed guards rolled up on them basically and escorted them out. So anyway, so there was a campaign around trying to protect this farm. And Francia Marquez, so we were talking about land at the Federation, and it was this women's meeting, and she's like, let me ask a question. Why are you thinking about land in these individual parsed out ways? What would happen if we thought about this collectively? And for folks who don't know, there's a whole collective titling campaign that was won in Colombia years ago. And I can't remember how many hectares now that they have, but they have a lot of hectares of land, of collectively titled land, right? And they have all this governance in place that's democratic, that helps to decide what's happening on the land. That was just fascinating to me. Now, let me also say they have palenques there too, maroon communities that we mentioned that they still have to this day. But it's just how do we have this space so that we have access to be able to grow the things we need, to, have the cultural space we need. Also, as radical folks, we need to train. We need to have safe space together to be together, to be able to know how to work through stuff in a safe space together, right? And so we need space. Let me also back up too and say with the Black Land and Power work too, what we do is we bring together Black land institutions because we think that that's really important. These are anchors and have always been anchors in our movement. Black farmers have always provided land and space for activists to meet, to strategize, and convene. And there's nothing like being on the land in nature and strategizing together. And so we need those places. We need those places sustained. We need them strong and we need them vibrant. And so it was really important to us to bring these land institutions, into our strategizing. And every place we have a meeting is always on Black land, and spaces that help to curate, or help us to be able to curate these conversations, but to be in nature and to be on land. And so that was super important. But just in all of that, the short of it is we can try to continue to protect land in these individualist ways, but that hasn't gotten us far, right? And so we have to think much more collectively about it. And then ultimately, again, racial capitalism is rooted in exploitation and extraction of labor, extraction of, resources, extraction of the earth. And that's antithetical to my values, right? And I believe many of our values. And so if we want a different system, if we want something that is not rooted in the exploitation of our labor, that doesn't, value, it's just complete profit for a very small few over our lives, over the sustainability of the planet, we want to see something different. It's going to take all of us to think about that collectively, and we need a different system. And then we have to apply that to land, right? Which also goes into how we feed ourselves, how we house ourselves, how we clothe ourselves. But if we think about some of the most inspiring economies to me, I've been to Cuba many times, and I'm super inspired by what does it mean when almost every person I talk to has a PhD because it was free and are mad healthy and never, have, food rations. So all your basic needs are met. Like I've always been inspired by economies that actually prioritize, again, people on the planet. And so I think we need a different way. We can't afford to replicate the system that, we're in now. We can't afford to replicate private ownership. We can't afford to replicate exploitation and extraction. We have to think about different ways. And so I think that the only way to be thinking about this is in how we build economies that value the community. And we have to practice that. Let me also say a key part of that, though, if we really believe, wait, can I say that, or did you have another question? Did you want to interject? Because I feel like okay.
Go ahead, do that. This is what we need to meet. You know what I mean? So we
okay, I was worried because I was like, wait. So if we're serious about solidarity economies, if we're serious about democratic governance, if we're serious about an economy that works for all of us, we have to get much more serious about how we understand power and power dynamics, and also how we understand and practice better. I started talking about this earlier, how to hear each other. You mentioned deep listening, but we need processes so that we can hear each other. And even in especially in difficult conversations, right? Some people shut down when we disagree, or they turn up completely and go in complete attack. And it's like, whoa, we just disagree and it's okay. So there's a lot of practice around that. And also, quite frankly, this doesn't mean that there's not leadership too, right? And structures in place that, so I also believe in thinking about how we structure our economies, structure our communities in a way that really facilitates folks being able to have input, with that, all of us being politicized, but also having leadership and structures in place to actually get us to where we're trying to go too. And so, but a part of I don't think we talk enough about if we believe in collective power, if we believe in collective work, what do we do about how we understand just skewed notions of power, misuse power, power over folks, things of that nature. Like, we really have to grapple with that because we've internalized that. That's why I say the work of deconstructing the ways in which we've been colonized. So the decolonizing process is an ongoing process every day, nonstop. If you're seeing what you're internalizing, and then you got to do checks all the time to see, is this ego? Is this, am I abusing? Am I, you just have to do that work on yourself in community together. And then we also have to have, we have to get back to having, which is what we're working on the Alliance too, just some processes to help people move through difficult conflict or conversations and conflict together, because we really need to invest in how we have what our comrades Mark Anthony Johnson and many other folks talk about, healing justice as a part of this work, right? Because we need to make sure, and Dr. Jafunza, many folks talk about this is how they started the Healthy Food Hub. But in so many ways, we internalize all this toxic, right, stuff from all the systems in which we're navigating. And so we have to do the work to heal, which healing is an ongoing journey, and also just check how we're showing up with each other and have systems in place to help us be healthier together when everything teaches us that we should be destroyed. And we internalize that and perpetuate that against each other. So what do we do if we really want to have healthy communities that can really be rooted in love and dignity and, respect for each other? And, if we really believe in collective. Otherwise, you'll have three people with a lot of power claiming to be, claiming to be collective. This is a solidarity economy and, whatever. So we got to do the work. We got to do our self-work, or work on ourselves. So.
Yeah, I am certainly at that point reminded of a phrase that, is often uttered, again, by Brother Kamal Rashid, when he talks about, if you want to examine the qualities of your organizational leadership, take a moment to pause and then imagine what would the world be like if they had power. If they had the capacity to kind of, dictate, and make governance, what would the world be like under that sort of leadership, right? So it's a framing where it's like, okay, well, this is how you're acting within an organization, but let's just expand that out. If we acted like this as a sort of general society, would it be functional? Would it be dysfunctional? And then perhaps that gives us a lens towards thinking about how we do organizational governance if we're private of that world, right? And something that, in fact, I'll have this question. I'll pose this question in a moment, but something that certainly, Sister Monica White, talked about her talk here at Chicago Food Policy Action Council around this prefigurative dynamics. Just really looking at how does this fit in the future. Does it fit? And if it doesn't fit, change it now. Don't wait to change it until the future. Change it now. So, what are some takeaways that you all are pulling off? I saw you had a call on Freedom Farmers. What are some takeaways that are coming out from your collective reading of Freedom Farmers that we might immerse ourselves in if we have not been on the call? And if we have been on the call, follow the National Black Food Justice Alliance page and get the details on how to get on that call. So
you said, what are some of the takeaways?
Yes. What are some of the takeaways that you all are coming from the text thus far?
Ooh, that's a good question. So I need to process that a little bit more to be able to answer that. What's coming to mind off the top of my head here is, and that might be because why power is so fresh for me too. So we've talked a lot about like defining power. There was a quote that I don't have offhand, but it was just something that it's a famous quote from Fannie Lou Hamer around basically, if you own, oh God, this is terrible. I don't like paraphrasing or whatever. But there's just a whole conversation around what it means, like what can we as an alliance who are working towards A lot of, what many organizations previously have done too, all that we think about in terms of self-determining food economies and land, what can we learn historically, right? And so it's like the conversations felt like an affirmation that the reason why we started an alliance together was spot on, because we need to do that, right? There's a lot of incredible work happening in the South, again, with the Federation of Southern Cooperatives, SAFON, Southeastern African American Farmers Organic Network, Southwest Georgia Project. There's really great work happening in the South, and there's really great work happening in the Midwest and all over regionally. But what does that look like, with some national strategies? And so, so I think governance came up a lot, just this notion of collective power, collective power, right? And so really just digging into how we get away from this individualist notion of power and just what does more collective power look like. It was really rich. Dr. White joined us today. I had to step away, so I actually missed the end of the call. So I can't tell you how we wrapped it up, unfortunately. But yeah, folks can definitely go to blackfoodjustice.org. And you can email us info@blackfoodjustice.org if you're interested. Today was our last session on this book, particularly with Freedom Farmers with Dr. White. So we're going to go on to our next reading. So we're going to have some interim readings, and then we'll pick up Dr. Shante Reese's book, Black Food Geographies, which is really important political context around food apartheid, particularly focused on the Deanwood area in Washington, D.C., but we'll be doing that. But back to Freedom Farmers, there's just so many lessons that I think we need to be learning from. And so we've been digging into, some of that. Again, I need some time to digest it, and especially when it's not so close to my bedtime. To come back to that, but yeah, it's just a lot of what's staying with me is a lot of thinking about, just power. Had a lot of conversation today around how we analyze the context in which we're navigating today versus, some of the examples that Dr. White lists up in the book, researches in the book too. And so, yeah, just a lot of really great conversation. We totally welcome people to join in on our book clubs. We, in our reading groups, we also invite, if you're a Black-led organization working on food and land, to definitely give us a shout if you want to join the Alliance. And we'll continue to study together because it's important. I think Dr. Nemhart mentioned, too, I think she wrote this in Collective Courage, and I've heard her say this, too, in sessions, that almost every iteration of a co-op, or a lot of this work comes out of shared study together, right? So there's something very powerful about collectively coming together to share, to study our conditions and history and theory. As we're applying theory, we want to be really deeply studied too. So we invite people to join us in the Alliance.
Absolutely. And on that note of study, that's a real perfect pivot for me to just make sure I note Cooperation for Liberation Study and Working Group is coming up again this Sunday. We are about to take a trip, hopefully, to Getting Grown Collective. We've just got some things confirmed in terms of our access to the space. But effectively, Cooperation for Liberation Study and Working Group is just as noted by Dara, is one of these spaces where we're talking through the aspects and elements of cooperative governance, of shared ownership, of cultivating, worker-owned cooperatives and democratic workplaces, but also cultivating the necessary relational tether that holds us and binds us together when we're talking about developing a cooperative, because it won't always be roses and it won't always be birds of paradise, but what do we do when it's not?
Mm-hmm.
What do we do when it's not? And coming up June 30th at Cooperation for Liberation, we'll be reviewing the Worker Cooperative Curriculum that we've been working through. We've been unpacking, collecting ourselves, and as well as Collective Courage, Jackson Rising, and the Next American Revolution by Grace Lee Ball. So really just going through a series of texts and just kind of picking apart and examining lessons that we can pull out of them doing report backs on those. So June 30th, we'll have the cooperative curriculum coming forward, and that's at 1434 West 51st Street from 3 p.m. to 5 p.m. So join us. We welcome that study. We welcome that gathering and that relationship building opportunities. So are there any closing thoughts that you would like to leave us with? We slightly overshot time, but it's been a rich conversation, so I appreciate you for that. So are there any closing thoughts you want to leave folks with?
No, I'm just really inspired by this. Mike, I think this is, I love the fact that y'all have a study group too. I'm just, and I've always been so inspired by your work ethic too, and your thoroughness, how much of a deep priority you place on studying as well, which I think is, and also how much you value community, right? Like it's something that is so transparent, so visceral. Like it's a beautiful thing to know that you and I have been in beautiful community together at the Healthy Food Hub and at Black Oaks, and that we can continue to be in community together because it's important. So I just have deep love for you, deep respect for you for this work. Thank you to the Kola Nut Collective. I love it. By the way, I have a tattoo here. My first tattoo is the Bese Saka symbol, which is the power power of agriculture and bringing community together. Yeah. And so, which is Kola Nut on mine. So hopefully I can be a Kola Nut fan. Well, I already am, but if there's an official title for fans, that'd be great. But thank you so much for having me on this. Again, just to encourage people, I totally agree with Mama Child. Join an organization, get involved, resist. These conditions don't have to be like this. We do have power, and we especially have power together. And so join an organization and push them to be as radical as possible, be unapologetically radical and unapologetically revolutionary, because that's what we need and that's what we deserve. Let's continue thinking about and practicing our values and living our values together. So I'll end with that.
Practicing our values together and living our values together.
Mm-hmm.
Yes.
Yeah.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. It's been a pleasure being in dialogue with you and connecting in this way. And I want to release you to your slumber if necessary. I'm sure there's lots of that stuff for. Yes. Thank you again for being on the call, being in the space, and just being you.
Thank you.
All right.
Thank you so much.
Have a good evening. All right, y'all. We are at the close of this segment. This is the Ujamaa Hour, where we are deliberately having conversations around how we are cultivating economic democracy in our communities already. You are already living in a solidarity economy. You are already participating in these relationships that are cooperative and that have these values at its basis. And ultimately, we just need to kind of identify those values, because if we can identify them, if we can be very deliberate and intentional about recognizing that these are the values that cultivate the types of futures, the types of economies, the types of governance systems that we want, then we can make sure that other folks show up in space, in community space, holding these same values. So I really appreciate you all for listening this evening, for being attentive to what was happening in the space. And I will see you on the next edition of the Ujamaa Hour. Coming up in the next segment, let me see. I believe we have Dion Lucas on the next segment. Give me just a moment, and I can confirm that for sure. Yes, actually, perhaps I won't be able to confirm that, but yes, I'm pretty certain that Deion Lucas is on the next segment. I'm just, certainly overwhelmed by the wonderful conversation that had held this evening, and I'm looking forward to digesting that. And I hope that you all have found value in what was happening. Boom. Okay. So yeah, my computer's locking up on me, and I have to go ahead and close that segment before it completely gives way. But be here for the next edition of the Ujamaa Hour. We are here every the second Monday of every month, and we will continue to bring you these conversations. We've got a lineup, that you wouldn't believe all throughout the year. Please check the Bieber group for the lineup. Please check the Kola Nut Collaborative Facebook page for the lineup, and you will